I want to talk about, in very general terms actually, about the values that underlie social democracy. But I want to begin with what has happened. This kind of background to what Rodney said about how you can come to have a Labor Prime Minister who is articulating ideas that seem to come from the right, from conservatism. And the reason for that is essentially because in the last 25 years, the right, the real right, in Australia and in the rest of the world is engaged in a fundamental rethinking and a deep ideological renewal of its views and values. And the consequence of that has been that an older style of traditional conservatism has changed and morphed into an aggressive free market right. That provides their own troops with an inspiring vision, whatever we might think of it. I mean, Abbott's not the whole story there, but those kinds of people like John Howard, do provide inspiration because they have this free market view. It's not just the free market, but that is the central thing, and it is the central mechanism that explains why you get people in the Liberal Party today who really don't want to talk about the Menzies legacy because there was too much socialism in it. On the broad left, what do we have? We're only really just beginning a kind of discussion of ideological views and values. And in all of this, I think what Tim said earlier about you've got to have a world view, that is absolutely essential, and that is what has been missing. The left has been in a reactive and defensive stance for a very, very long while. And the kind of intellectual or ideological or vision renewal that we have had has been a kind of, at best, it's a kind of putting together a useful coalition of ideas and values from unions, ethnic groups, women, the environment lobby and so on. And at worst, what that is a kind of opportunist patchwork with no guiding values, no organising ideas, and which constantly defaults to special deals and political patronage. And along the way, what has happened is that Labor has accepted far too much of the free market dogma, a dogma which argues that it doesn't matter what the question is because the answer is always the same. We need to privatise, we need more market. We're here today, I think, because the kind of way in which the right has set a political agenda for many, many years has meant that we have a government of the right poised to take power nationally, which will introduce some of the most deeply reactionary ideas that we've ever seen. If you ask people, and I now want to turn to the kind of fundamental values and ideas that I think we need, if you ask people what Labor does stand for or should stand for, you get all sorts of answers about it should be equality, it should be care for others, it should be social justice. These are important, I think, but I think this misses out on something more fundamental, which has actually been mentioned several times, and that is the notion that people, and especially working people, have a common interest in certain things, as well as having individual self-interest. That is, there are some things which can only be achieved jointly and by cooperation, which cannot be achieved privately or individually. And it's another name, really, for the common good or the public interest. The idea that working people, or today people more generally, share a set of common interests may seem obvious, but it's been a profoundly important point in defining social democracy for 150 years. It's also, this notion of the common good is a deeply attractive notion out there in the community, and that came through in some of the things that Rebecca Huntley said this morning about the need for social cohesion, the love of community that most people have. In terms of social democracy, this notion of a common interest began really with the creation of trade unions, which was a recognition that individual workers faced a common threat from exploitative employers, and that the only way that they could fight back against that was by collective action and by collective structures, which would mean all would benefit. And the spirit of common interests was carried over into programs of government by the first social democratic parties in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so you had the creation of public institutions, such as schools, hospitals, public services, libraries, and so on. And all of this really was the infrastructure of a civilised society in place of a jungle of self-interest. At the moment, we're seeing, partly thanks to Labor, but mainly due to the Conservatives, a kind of slow reconstruction of Australian society into one in which self-interest and individualism are elevated into the supreme good, not just in any vague sense, but in the actual policies that governments are introducing. The first wave of that occurred with privatisation of a large number of government institutions, and we now face a second wave of marketisation, which is highlighted by Julia Gillard's love of the creating a market in public education where parents choose commodities and schools compete. I mean, this is a bizarre notion. It has nothing to do with, it's meant to be clever and smart and outsmarting the neoliberals at their own game, but I think it's profoundly a step backwards. I want to finish what I want to say ultimately with a reference to the contemporary situation, but again go back to the 19th century because, as someone said, that was a kind of brief of looking backwards, looking forwards. So when social democracy began in the 19th century, its notion of the common good, which was called socialism in those days, was aimed at building institutions to protect people from the vagaries of the market and from poverty. Social democratic philosophy was based on a notion of the common good as a form of protection, of security and of solidarity against threats. It's often, that can be a very conservative notion, the idea that you're threatened, that you're insecure and so on. But it obviously can be very real. A lot has changed today. The underpinnings of a civilised society exist thanks to social democracy and its agenda. But today we face a new round of threats, not just from unfettered markets, but from the very consequences of humanity's struggle to live well and to prosper. That threat is climate change, and with it, even deeper questions of sustainability. Grappling with present difficulties in terms of traditional social democratic practices is part of the solution. Social democratic outlook, both practically and theoretically, has involved improving living standards and the quality of life. Very, very good things. Social democracy never conceived of the idea that one day you would have to talk and think in terms of limits. It never conceived that there could be an end or there could be a closure to the endless and ever-increasing rising living standards, or that has to be thought and reconfigured. Yet this is the case. Climate change is an unavoidable and world-shaking set of events whose dangerous consequences are getting closer every year. Integrating an understanding of it and a response into a traditional social democratic philosophy is difficult but not impossible. In doing so, we need to ground our response in the two basic values I've outlined: a modernised sense of the common good and a new idea and a new warning about protection and security from threats.